The functioning of the human brain is one of life's greatest mysteries. Scientists have more knowledge of the physical reactions that occur in space than of that which exists inside their own heads. Neuroscience, the study of this wonderful human organ, constantly tends to present contradictions like any other field of science. One time they say that depression has a lot to do with the hypothalamus and with the reduction of the prefrontal cortex area. And a few years later they say, nah, there's nothing like that, man, just forget about it. Oh yeah, serotonin, the biggest reason why people get depressed. And a few years later they say, nah, there's nothing like that, just forget about it. And it continues like this forever. The only thing that we can have a big true notion of is the anatomy of the brain, because this is much more of a factual and a physical and physiological apparatus, and not only based on the reactions that are happening microscopically and which we can only hypothesize. Which is, in a sense, very similar to the MBTI, or the 16 personalities theory, something that everyone seems to believe really exists, but when it comes to explaining it in reality, well, no one really knows how it works, despite being closely related to the Big Five, which is truly a scientific model of psychology. So I thought, well, what is the correlation between the MBTI, the pseudoscience with little scientific basis, and neuroscience, this completely unpredictable science, which is largely disregarded even in the field of medicine? And the answer I found was Judaism. You know, in Jewish Kabbalah, man is divided into three levels. First one, there is Nefesh, which represents the physical nature of desires and instincts. Ruach, which separates what is good and what is evil, linked to morality. Neshama, which is the superior soul, separating human being from other life forms and gives consciousness of God. But if you stop to think about it, these are actually the functions of the MBTI. Nefesh is the sensation, which derives from the physical reality of things. Ruach is the feeling, which is linked to agreeableness or socialization. Since many of our morals derive from the relationships that we have with other people, these relationships tells us what we should value. According to Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson, these would be the same as saying that they define our positive or negative emotions. Therefore, it is very related to the feeling in MBTI. And also, there's Neshama, which would be the thinking part, because it is more linked to conscientiousness, rationality, and thought, which philosophers like René Descartes would say is what separates us from any other animal, which is not exactly true, but perhaps it is. And then you ask, well, what about intuition? Well, who knows? Maybe it could be God. But let's leave that for later, because we have another important question here, which is, how is all of this connected with the brain? And the answer of this is this division made by this neuroscientist called Paul MacLean. This is how the brain can be separated into three parts. First, the medulla and the cerebellum, which compose the reptilian or instinctual brain, that controls the body's movements and tells us about our sensations or instincts and automatic responses of the body towards the environment or towards itself, such as the heartbeat, the breathing, the muscle contraction, etc. Then there is the limbic system, also called the mammalian or the emotional brain, which defines our feelings and emotional responses, our sense of ethics and morality towards behaviors that are socially acceptable or relevant. And finally, there is the neocortex, or the rational brain, which will be the newest part, so to speak, of evolution, and which predicts our thinking, our rationality, our decisions, and which only finishes developing around the age of 25, which explains the impulsiveness of teenagers, and also a much higher number of pregnancies during this phase of life. Now, if you are intelligent, and I know you are because you're watching this video, you will realize how this division of the brain, the Jewish Kabbalah and the MBTI, seem to be all interconnected, or even be one of the same. But still, we come to this initial question. What about intuition? Well, in the Big Five, this personality model I've already explained on this channel, the trait openness to experience seems to have a closer relationship to the description of intuition, People with higher openness to experience tend to be more creative, more abstract, more into ideas, theories, and probably MBTI. They have a greater affinity with the arts, culture, and things that go beyond the conventional norm. Furthermore, the trait also is very linked to creativity, which also has a strong relationship with intelligence. In other words, the talk about intuitives being more intelligent is partially true, considering the correlation with these other personality traits. Therefore, it is not possible to classify intuition in the brain, specifically a place at least, because intelligence does not have anything to do with a specific part of the brain. You can imagine that perhaps it has something to do with the prefrontal cortex, but being rational does not equal that you are more intelligent. It doesn't even mean that you are less emotional, actually. The cortex is more connected to the conscientiousness, which would be judgment, in the MBTI letters, or extroverted thinking in the functions. People with higher conscientiousness are much more likely to work, to be organized, to set long-term goals for life, and to make decisions that are more based on concrete reality of things. But it could also have something to do with a greater inhibition of the limbic system, or of the emotional brain, causing them to not only have lower agreeableness, which would be also thinking, and which would also be thinking in the MBTI. But what defines intelligence in the brain is actually this thing called plasticity. That is, the way of the brain is formed and also reformed in a sense. People with higher IQs not only have more brain connections, but they also make connections faster, such as people with extroverted intuition, who tend to connect different ideas and topics with each other, which is also related to dopamine, which has something to do with arousal and conditioning, but much more specifically dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, or the rational brain, that is used for those tasks of conscientiousness. And which tasks, you may ask? Those of looking towards the future outcomes, of visualizing them at least. So perhaps intuition has something more to do with how the brain is connected rather with that specific part of it. And that's it. That was the video. Goodbye.